Afternoon, the 23rd of May. A 17-year-old girl in white armor leans forward in her saddle outside the walls of a town called Campigny, watching her own soldiers get swallowed by smoke and dust and the panic of a retreat. Her horse turns to follow them home, and that's when she sees it. The gate ahead of her is closing. Her men are already inside. She is still outside. Riders are closing in from 3 sides of the meadow, and she has maybe 60 seconds left as a free woman. She doesn't know it yet, but within the hour she'll be pulled off her horse and sold like cargo. Within a year she'll be dead. And 500 years from now, people like you will still be lying in the dark, listening to how it happened. Get comfortable. I want to take you all the way back to the beginning, to a girl born in mud and candle smoke who never learned to read, and who somehow ended up deciding the fate of a kingdom. Hello and welcome back. Wherever you're listening from tonight, I'm glad you're here. For the next while, it's just the two of us, a low candle, and a very old story that still hasn't finished being told. To understand the girl on the horse outside Campigny, you first have to understand the war she was born into. Because by the time she took her first breath, that war was already older than anyone alive could remember starting. England and France had been fighting on and off for nearly 100 years by then. Not one war, really, more like a long, grinding weather system that never fully passed. It would go quiet for a decade, and everyone would start to hope it was over, and then it would flare up again over some old grievance about who actually owned the French crown. The English kings claimed it through a great-grandmother's bloodline. The French said that claim was worthless, that the crown didn't pass through women, and that was that. Neither side would back down, and neither side could quite finish the other off. So it just went on. Fields left fallow because there was no one to plant them. Bridges guarded by soldiers who'd forgotten which side they were originally fighting for. A whole generation that grew up not knowing what peacetime even sounded like. 3 years before our girl was born, a young English king, barely into his 20s, restless and ambitious, crossed the Channel with an army and met the French on a rain-soaked field called Agincourt. What happened there took less than 3 hours. English longbowmen dug into narrow, muddy ground, tore the French cavalry apart before it ever reached them. 6,000 French dead by some counts, whole noble houses erased in a single wet afternoon, while the English king walked back to his tent that evening and calmly dictated letters home, like a man reporting on the weather. Here's the part that mattered most, though, and it happened 5 years later, when our girl was still a small child learning to sit still in church. The English king forced through a treaty that quietly did something almost unthinkable. It disinherited the rightful heir to the French throne, a young man named Charles. Set him aside like he'd never been born, and instead promised the future crown of France to the English king's own infant son. The old French king, by then half-mad and easily led, signed off on it, apparently even willing to believe the rumor that his own son wasn't really his. And then, almost as if the story wanted to make a point about how fragile all of this really was, the English king who'd won everything died young of dysentery on campaign, and his 9-month-old baby became King of England. And on paper, King of France too. Somewhere out there, that baby is going to grow into a boy who will eventually stand across a battlefield from a teenage girl he's never met and lose to her. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because of all this, France by the early 1420s was a country with 2 kings and 1 crown. The English and their allies, the powerful Duchy of Burgundy, held Paris and the wealthy north. The disinherited young man, Charles, the one shoved aside by treaty, held little more than a ribbon of land along the Loire River in the south, and was mockingly called the King of Bourgs by people who didn't think he'd last. That was the France our girl was born into. Not a history book war. A daily one, the sound of church bells ringing for victories that weren't hers. A cousin who came home from a siege missing a hand. A father arriving home some evening with the flat, tired news that another town nearby had fallen. Take that war away, and there's no story here tonight. There's just a farmer's daughter who spins wool, marries a neighbor's son, and dies quietly in her 60s in the same small village she was born in. The war is the entire reason you're hearing her name at all. That village was called Domrémy, and if you went looking for it today, you'd have to look carefully. A green, quiet fold of land on the left bank of the Meuse River in what's now northeastern France. Back then, it belonged to a small duchy called Bar, and it sat almost exactly on the invisible line that split the country in 2, loyal to the disinherited Charles on one side of the river, loyal to Burgundy and the English on the other. It was tiny. 20 or 30 families at most. One real street, a stone church at one end, shared fields at the other, timber houses leaning into each other for warmth against winters that lasted too long. The soil was thin. Wheat, oats, rye, a little flax, a few pigs and chickens. Nobody in Domrémy expected to be remembered by anyone. And yet, in a small house near that church, sometime around the year 1412, a daughter was born to a farmer named Jacques d'Arc and his wife, Isabelle Remay. I want to stop here for a second, because there's a version of this story that gets repeated so often it's practically become the official one. Poor, starving peasant girl, barefoot in the mud, plucked from utter obscurity by the hand of God, and it's not really true, and I think the truth is actually more interesting. Jacques d'Arc W. Asn't destitute. He owned his own land, which in that century was no small thing. He held a real position in the village, collecting dues, organizing the shared work of the fields, and before that he'd worked gathering the salt tax, which meant he'd traveled a little, dealt with officials, understood how the wider world outside Domrémy actually functioned. Isabelle's family had some standing too. Her surname, Remay, was the kind given to someone whose family had made the long pilgrimage to Rome, not a small undertaking for ordinary people in that era. They had 4 children who lived past infancy, and our girl was the youngest. When Burgundian raiders swept through the region and the neighboring village of refugees needed somewhere to shelter, it was the D'Arc household that took some of them in. You don't host refugees when you have nothing yourself, so set aside the ragged orphan picture. Picture instead a clever, watchful girl growing up in a respectable, hard-working household, one with just enough stability to hand her something a genuinely poor child of that century would never have had. Time to sit in the cool stone quiet of the church because she liked being there, not because someone was making her. Time to walk the fields at dusk and watch the river go by. time, eventually, to hear something no one else could. She grew up doing what every girl in Domrémy did. She learned to spin wool, to sew, to keep the fire fed, to mind the sheep along the riverbank with the other children of the village. Decades later, when people who'd known her as a child were asked to describe her under oath, their memories lined up with almost eerie consistency. A serious girl, they said. Quiet. She liked listening more than talking. She went to church more often than she strictly had to. She gave away what little she had extra of without being asked. Nobody remembered her as odd, exactly. Just attentive in a way that made grown adults slightly uncomfortable, the way children sometimes are when they seem to be paying closer attention to the world than the world is paying to them. She never learned to read or write. That much is almost certainly true. In a village the size of Domrémy, the priest was probably the only person who could read reliably, and the single missal kept at the church was likely the only book in the entire place. Agreements were sealed with a handshake, not a signature. Years later, in a cold cell awaiting trial, she would manage to scratch out a wobbly, childish version of her own name. And that, as far as anyone can tell, was the entire extent of her literacy, from birth to death. Then, in the summer of 1428, when she was around 16, a serious drought settled over the region. The mews ran shallow and brown, crops shriveled in the fields, cattle sickened and some died. And as happened almost everywhere in that century, whenever the harvest failed, people in the village began looking for someone to blame, and old women with no husbands to protect them started to hear the word witch whispered behind their backs. According to her own later testimony, Joan went to her father and told him plainly that the accused women shouldn't be touched, that it wasn't right. And strangely, for a farmer, in a century where that kind of talk from a teenage daughter would ordinarily be brushed off, he listened. No one in Domrémy was harmed that year. It's a small detail, easy to skip past, but I don't think you should. It tells you that by 16, this girl already had a way of making grown men stop and reconsider. That skill didn't appear from nowhere a year later. It had been building the whole time, because a year before that drought, when she was around 13, something had already started happening to her. Alone in the small garden behind her father's house, that she would spend the rest of her short life trying to explain to people who had absolutely no framework for believing her. It was midday, she said, summer. She was standing near the church wall when she heard a voice, and then almost immediately after it saw a bright light beside her off to the right toward the church. The voice was, she said later, very fine and full of goodness, gentle. It frightened her at first, the way anything that comes from nowhere frightens a child, but it wasn't telling her anything strange. Be good, go to church often. That was all at the start. She thought at first that she might be imagining it, the way any 13-year-old would. It didn't stop. It came again and again. And slowly, over the following 2 or 3 years, the voice became voices. She would come to identify them when pressed later by men who badly wanted her to be either lying or mad, as Saint Michael and Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. They didn't just tell her to be good anymore. They started telling her what to do. Go to a town called Vaucouleurs. Find a man there who could get her an armed escort. Travel to the disinherited Dauphin, the same Charles, still holding out along the Loire, and tell him, a farm girl with no name and no standing whatsoever, that he needed to be crowned king at Rheims Cathedral in the traditional way on English-held ground in the middle of a war. And before any of that could happen, she needed to lift a siege, a real one with real cannon and real starving people inside, at a city called Orléans. That was the entire plan laid out to a barely literate teenager in her father's garden, years before any of it would happen. And here's the part that should genuinely keep you up at night if you let it. She went on to do every single piece of it, almost exactly in that order. I'm not going to pretend to know what was actually happening in that garden. Nobody does, and nobody ever will, not the theologians who examined her, not the judges who tried her, not the historians who have spent 600 years arguing about it since. What I can tell you, and what I think matters more than the argument over what the voices actually were, is this, whatever they were, a genuine mystical experience, or the only language available to an intensely serious young woman in a deeply religious century for naming a conviction she had no other way to express? They didn't invent her courage. They didn't invent her stubbornness, or her strange, unshakable calm under pressure that would later stun trained soldiers 3 times her age. Those were already hers, sitting quietly inside a farmer's daughter in a village nobody had heard of. The voices just gave her somewhere to point them. Before any of that could happen, though, there was a much smaller battle to fight first, inside her own house. Her father, by her own later testimony, had once dreamed she would run off with soldiers, and the dream had frightened him badly enough that he'd told her brothers, only half joking, that if it ever actually happened, he'd rather drown her himself than see it come true. Her mother wanted a normal life for her, a husband, a household, children, the same quiet path every other girl in Domrémy was expected to walk. There was even, at one point, a young man from a neighboring family who claimed she'd promised to marry him, a claim she flatly denied in front of a church court and won. She loved her parents. She said so plainly more than once, and it clearly cost her something real to walk away from that small stone house without their blessing. But she left anyway, before dawn, telling almost no one, because by then the voices had become louder than her fear of disappointing the 2 people she loved most in the world. It's worth sitting with that for a second. Long before any battlefield, before any king, the very first thing this story ever asked of her was the hardest thing it would ever ask. To walk out a door her own parents didn't want opened. In the late spring of 1428, she crossed the river with a purpose that had nothing to do with sheep or spinning wool, and walked to Vaucouleurs, a small fortified town loyal to Charles, about an hour away on foot. The man in charge there was Robert de Baudricourt, a hard, weathered soldier who'd spent years scraping together the resources to hold this one stretch of river against the Burgundians, and who did not, on that particular afternoon, have the patience for a teenage peasant girl, informing him that God had personally sent her to save the kingdom of France. He laughed her out of the room, told the relative who'd brought her to take her home and slap some sense into her, more or less. She went home, and then she came back. And when he sent her away again, she came back a 3rd time. There's something almost funny about it if you picture it plainly enough. a hardened captain, month after month, being worn down not by an army, but by one teenage girl's absolute refusal to stop showing up at his door. At some point during one of these visits, she told him something specific, a detail of military news from far off at the front that, as far as anyone in Vaucouleurs knew, hadn't reached them yet by any normal messenger. Days later, word arrived confirming it was true. We don't know how she knew. Maybe she'd simply guessed well, or heard some fragment of gossip nobody else had bothered to track. But it did something to Baudricourt that months of pleading hadn't managed. By early 1429, he gave in. He gave her a horse, a small armed escort, let her cut her hair short like a soldier's, and dressed her in men's clothes, a tunic, hose, riding boots, practical for the road, and safer, frankly, for a girl traveling for 11 days through territory where anything could happen to her otherwise. And with that, she set out for the Dauphin's court at a castle called Chinon. Picture that ride for a moment, because it's easy to skip past as a line in a summary and much harder to actually sit inside. 11 days on horseback, through land that was nominally loyal but never full. Lie safe, a girl dressed as a man surrounded by armed strangers who, only weeks earlier, had thought the whole idea of escorting her was faintly ridiculous. Two of those men, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, lived long enough to testify about it decades later, and what they described wasn't a girl playing dress-up. She rode as well as any of them, they said. She refused every single night to sleep anywhere near a man outside her own small escort. She went to confession constantly, more than seemed strictly necessary, as if she were preparing herself for something none of them yet understood. And she told them, plainly and without any theatrics, that this whole journey was a mission handed to her by God, and that anyone who helped her carry it out would be blessed for it. Jean de Metz said, years afterward, that he couldn't fully explain it, but that simply being near her on that road had made him feel braver than he'd ever felt before. Somewhere along that route, they stopped at a small chapel in a place called Fierbois, and according to a story impossible to confirm and endlessly repeated ever since, Joan asked whether there might be an old sword buried behind the altar of St. Catherine. There was. Nobody in the chapel had known it was there. She had it dug up, had the rust cleaned from it, and wore it for a time afterward, though she'd later say that in the end, it was her banner, not any sword, that she truly loved carrying. On the 23rd of February, 1429, she rode into Chinon with short hair, borrowed men's clothes, an unlikely sword at her hip, and a level of certainty that unsettled everyone who saw her. Chinon was a genuine royal court, full of nervous diplomats, watchful clergy, courtiers who'd spent years learning how to read a room before they said a word in it. And Charles himself, at 26, was in a difficult state of mind by the time she arrived, disinherited by treaty, widely whispered about as illegitimate, nearly out of money, losing a war he'd been born into and never asked for. And now here was a farm girl at his gates, refusing to leave until she'd spoken to him directly. The story that's been told and retold ever since is that Charles decided to test her dressed plainly, on purpose, and stood himself among his own courtiers so she'd have to pick him out of a crowd without ever having seen his face, and that she walked straight past every richly dressed nobleman in that hall and bode without hesitation, in front of the one man dressed like everyone else. Historians still argue about whether that moment happened exactly as described, or whether it hardened into legend somewhere in the retelling over the following years. What's certain is that Charles agreed to see her alone, was impressed enough by whatever passed between them in that private conversation to send her onward to be formally examined by a panel of theologians at the city of Poitiers, and that after weeks of careful, occasionally hostile questioning, that panel reported back that there was nothing in her that contradicted the faith, and that she was, in their judgment, worthy of being trusted. They'd asked her all manner of things. What language did her voices speak? French, she told them, a detail the panel apparently found reassuring, since it meant she wasn't claiming contact with some foreign or suspicious power. Why did she insist on dressing as a man? More practical for riding and for war, she said, and her voices hadn't told her to stop. It wasn't a triumphant theological endorsement so much as a cautious shrug from men who had nothing left to lose by trying her. The war was going badly enough that even an improbable teenage girl was worth a gamble. One exchange from Poitiers is worth lingering on, because it shows exactly how she handled men trying to catch her out. A friar in the room, testing her, said that if she truly wanted them to believe God had sent her, she ought to simply prove it with a sign right there on the spot. She's said to have answered that she hadn't come to Poitiers to perform tricks, that she'd been sent to lift the siege of Orléans, and that if they gave her soldiers, the sign they wanted would be the siege itself being lifted. It's a strange thing to notice about a barely literate farm girl facing down-trained theologians, but she kept doing this again and again throughout her short life, refusing to argue on anyone else's terms and simply offering instead to be proven right by what happened next. Charles, let her go to Orléans. The city had been under siege since the previous October, a tightening ring of English forts circling its walls, close enough in places that the two sides could shout insults at each other across the gap. For months, the people trapped inside had been eating rats, boiled leather, anything that could pass for food. If Orléans fell, the entire South lay open, and the Dauphin's cause, such as it was, would very likely die with it. If it held, there was still barely a France left to fight for. Joan arrived on the evening of the 29th of April, 1429, riding a black horse in white armor that had been made specially for her, holding a banner she'd had painted herself, a white field showing God holding the world in his hands, with the words Jesus Maria stitched above it. She wasn't given command of the army. That belonged properly to an experienced commander named Dunois, the half-brother of the Duke of Orléans, a man who'd been fighting this war since before Joan was born. But she rode with every assault that followed, prayed with the soldiers before they went in, and by every surviving account, the army fought differently, hungrier, braver, less willing to break and run, with her banner visible above the smoke than it had without her. On the 7th of May, during an assault on one of the English strongholds guarding the approach to the city, an arrow caught her in the shoulder, just above the collarbone, and drove her briefly out of the fight. She wept from the pain. By her own admission later, she was, after all, still only 17. But she had the arrow pulled free, had the wound bound up, and rode back into the fighting that same day, her banner raised again above the smoke before the sun had even set. By the following morning, the 8th of May, the English abandoned every position around the city and marched north in retreat. 9 days. That was the entire length of her presence at Orléans before a siege the English had been confident of winning for 6 straight months simply came apart. There's a small moment from that week I keep coming back to, out of everything that happened. When the first supply convoy finally made it across the Loire and into the starving city, a soldier filled a plain wooden cup with river water and handed it to Joan, and she drank it there in front of everyone without ceremony, just water after half a year of nothing. For the people watching, half-starved and hardly able to believe the siege was actually breaking, it must have tasted like the entire war quietly turning in their favor. Orléans wasn't the ending. It was only the opening move. Over the following weeks, the army she rode with pushed down the Loire, taking town after town, Jargeau, where a stone launched from the walls struck her helmet and knocked her briefly senseless before she climbed back to her feet, Meung-sur-Loire, Beaugency, until on the 18th of June they caught the retreating English army out in the open at a place called Padé before it could properly form its lines. The same longbowmen who had shattered French cavalry at Agincourt 14 years earlier were overrun this time before they'd even finished driving their defensive stakes into the ground. The English commander fled the field on horseback. It was over inside an afternoon. After Padé, the road east to Reims, the traditional city of coronation, the place where French kings had been crowned for centuries, simply opened. Towns that had spent years under Burgundian or English control began surrendering without a fight, sometimes sending out delegations before the army had even reached their walls. The Duke of Burgundy quietly pulled his garrisons back rather than risk a direct confrontation with whatever this girl and her army actually were. And on Sunday, the 17th of July, 1429, Charles was crowned in Reims Cathedral, anointed with the holy oil in the ceremony that made a French king legitimate in the eyes of his own people, not merely a claimant with soldiers. Joan stood near the altar through the whole thing, holding her banner upright. Afterward, she knelt in front of him, and by her own account, told him simply that the task she'd been sent to do was now finished. It didn't end the war, far from it. But it changed permanently how Charles's claim to the throne could be dismissed. And for those few extraordinary months, an illiterate farm girl from a village nobody could find on a map was the most talked about person in the entire kingdom of France. What followed the coronation was quieter, and in its own way, sadder than anything that had come before it. Joan wanted to march straight on Paris and finish what had been started, take back the capital, break the English hold on the north for good, while the momentum was still hers. Charles, newly crowned and suddenly far more cautious than the desperate young dauphin who'd let a peasant girl gamble on his behalf, wanted to negotiate instead. There were men around him now, courtiers, advisors, men like Georges de la Trémille, who had spent years learning how to survive at court through caution and compromise, not through charging at walls. And their voices, quietly and patiently, began to carry more weight in the king's ear than a teenage girl's certainty ever could once the crisis had passed. In September, the army did move on Paris after all, and Joan was wounded. Ed again, this time in the thigh by a crossbow bolt during a stalled assault at one of the city gates. The attack failed. The army pulled back, and not long after, Charles opened talks with the Duke of Burgundy that produced a truce nobody involved seriously intended to honor. A pause bought with promises that both sides understood, even as they signed them, would eventually be broken. Joan didn't understand the hesitation, and by every account, she never really learned to pretend that she did. Her voices had been right about everything so far, town after town, exactly as promised, so why stop now while the war was still there to be won? She had become, almost without noticing the shift happening around her, something inconvenient to people who had been glad enough to use her when using her was the only option left. She wasn't dismissed outright. That would have been its own kind of scandal, given everything she'd already delivered. But she was, quietly, no longer at the center of the decisions being made. By the spring of 1430, with the truce already collapsing and fighting resuming across the north, she was sent to Compiègne. Not because anyone believed the war could still be won the way it had been won at Orléans, but because there was, by then, simply no one else quite willing to keep riding out at the head of a doomed sortie. She was 19 years old. She had been at war for a little over a year. In that year she had been wounded more than once, ridden hundreds of miles across contested ground, stood beside a king at his own coronation, and watched in real time as the same king who owed her his crown began, very gently and very deliberately, to set her aside. And that brings us back at last to where this story actually began. The 23rd of May, 1430, the sortie outside Compiègne falling apart in the smoke, the English and Burgundian riders closing in from 3 directions across an open meadow, Joan turning her horse to follow her own retreating soldiers back toward the safety of the walls, and finding, when she reached the gate, that it was already swinging shut. Whether it was closed on direct order, out of panic, or simple bad timing in the chaos of a losing fight, no one has ever fully settled, but the effect was the same either way. She was on the wrong side of the wall, alone in the open with a handful of men still loyal enough to stay beside her, while an enemy that had been trying to capture her for over a year suddenly had her exactly where they'd always wanted her. She fought. That part isn't in dispute. Even the men who captured her later admitted she didn't surrender easily, didn't simply raise her hands and wait for it to be over. She was eventually pulled from her horse, some accounts say by her own cloak, grabbed and hauled backward off the saddle, struck, according to some testimony, on the head and taken. Just like that, the girl who had broken a 6-month siege in 9 days, who had crowned a king in a cathedral full of nobles, who had walked past a room of courtiers and picked her king out of a crowd of strangers, was a prisoner. And there was nothing left standing between her and everything that was about to happen to her. She was held first by the Burgundian commander who'd actually captured her, a man named Jean de Luxembourg, and for a while her captivity was almost civilized by the standards of the century, moved between a handful of castles, kept in reasonable comfort while negotiations over her fate went on quietly behind closed doors. Everyone involved fully aware of exactly how valuable she'd suddenly become. She didn't simply wait for those negotiations to decide her future. She tried to escape more than once. At one castle, Beaurevoir, she is said to have climbed out of a high tower window rather than accept being handed over to the English, whom she apparently feared far more than she feared the fall itself, and fell hard enough that she was found unconscious on the ground below, injured but alive, and recaptured before she'd gone more than a few steps. Eventually, money settled what months of politics hadn't. The English bought her outright from Jean de Luxembourg for a sum recorded at somewhere between 10 and 20,000 livres. An almost absurd amount of money for a single teenage prisoner of war, which tells you, more clearly than any account of the fighting could, exactly how badly they wanted her, and exactly how much they feared what she'd already come to represent. And here is the part worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains everything that came next. The English didn't simply want her dead. A straightforward execution as a captured enemy combatant would have been easy enough to arrange, and would have made her a martyr almost instantly. A girl killed for fighting for her king, mourned, and remembered exactly the way she'd want to be remembered. What they wanted instead was for the church itself to condemn her. A heresy, not warfare. If churchmen declared her a fraud, a witch, someone who deceived an entire kingdom in God's name, then killing her would look like justice being served rather than an enemy simply eliminating a threat it couldn't defeat on the battlefield. They found a bishop willing to run exactly that kind of trial. A man named Pierre Cochan, ambitious, politically tied closely to the English cause, who agreed to preside over her case on one very specific condition: that it take place on English-held ground in the city of Rouen, far from anyone who might be inclined to speak in her defense. The trial opened on the 9th of January, 1431, in the chapel of Rouen's castle, in front of roughly 60 clerics, the overwhelming majority of them sympathetic to the English cause before a single question had even been asked. Almost everything about how it was conducted broke the Church's own established rules for handling a case like hers. She was held not in a church prison under the watch of nuns, as canon law required for a woman facing ecclesiastical charges, but in a secular military prison, guarded day and night by English soldiers. She was kept in irons for much of it, chained even inside her own cell, an indignity that had no real legal justification and existed, as far as anyone can tell, mainly to wear her down before the questioning had even properly begun. The charges piled up around her over the following weeks: heresy, witchcraft, false claims of divine communication, and again returning to it obsessively, the simple fact that she wore men's clothing. The entire proceeding was conducted in Latin, a language a farmer's daughter from Domrémy had never had any opportunity to learn, which meant that for most of her own trial, she was answering questions she could only partly follow, in a language that wasn't hers, in front of men who had spent their entire lives being trained in exactly this kind of interrogation. Her actual words survive today only through the notary's translations and summaries, filtered, in other words, through the very system trying to convict her. And still, somehow, she held her own. Picture the room for a moment, because I think it's worth picturing properly. A 19-year-old girl in chains facing 60 educated men who between them had decades more legal training than she'd had years of life, in a language she couldn't fully follow, with no lawyer, no advisor, no single friendly face anywhere in that chapel. And question after question came at her not to find the truth, but to trap her, carefully built, both ways lose questions that a trained theologian would have struggled to answer safely, let alone an illiterate farm girl. One of them has survived clearly enough, word for word, to still make people go quiet when they hear it read aloud. They asked her whether she believed she was in a state of grace. It was a question with no safe answer at all. If she said yes, she was claiming a certainty about her own soul that only God Himself could rightly know, which was itself a kind of arrogance bordering on heresy. If she said no, she was admitting doubt, conceding that everything she'd claimed about her voices might have been built on unstable ground. Either answer could be twisted into a conviction. She paused and then said simply that if she was not in a state of grace, she prayed God would put her there, and if she was, she prayed God would keep her there. It's the kind of answer that experienced clergy in that chapel reportedly admitted, quietly afterward, they wouldn't have known how to give any better themselves. They asked her over and over in different forms why she insisted on wearing men's clothing even now, in prison, even after everything it had cost her in this trial. And every time her answer stayed essentially the same. It was practical. Safer in a cell surrounded by male guards to be dressed as one of them rather than as a woman alone among soldiers. Her voices, she said, hadn't told her she needed to change it. It sounds, on the surface, like such a small thing to build a heresy case around, a matter of clothing. But in the framework the court had constructed, it was actually the perfect charge, because unlike her military victories, which no one in that room could honestly dispute, or her claims about voices, which were genuinely unprovable either way, her clothing was a fact anyone could see with their own eyes, day after day, sitting right there in front of them, refusing to change. Weeks turned into months. She was questioned publicly and then privately in her cell without the same witnesses present, in sessions that broke even the loose rules the earlier public sessions had followed. She grew tired, genuinely, physically tired, in a way you can feel in her later answers, which grow shorter, plainer, less willing to explain herself in the elaborate way she had at the start. And finally, in late May, worn down B. Why months of this, frightened by threats of being burned that very day if she didn't comply, she was brought out publicly and shown a document. She couldn't read it. She was told it was a formal confession, an admission that her voices had been false, that she would submit fully to the judgment of the church and never again claim to hear them. Under enormous pressure, exhausted, afraid, she agreed to mark it, a shaky cross, roughly where her name should go, the only kind of signature she'd ever known how to make. For a moment, it looked like it might actually save her life. The sentence was commuted to life imprisonment instead of death. She put on women's clothing again, as the confession required. And then, only days later, back in her cell, she was found once more dressed as a man. What actually happened in that cell has never been fully settled, and probably never will be, but the most consistent account, repeated by witnesses at the retrial decades afterward, is a quietly damning one. Her women's clothes were simply taken away from her overnight, left just out of reach, while the men's clothing she'd worn before was left within it. She had nothing else to wear. Her judges, the same men who controlled every single condition of her imprisonment, called it a deliberate relapse into heresy, a willful return to her old defiance, evidence that her earlier confession had never been sincere at all. They had engineered the very violation they then used to condemn her. On the morning of the 30th of May, 1431, she was led out into the old market square in Rouen, where overnight a wooden platform and a stake had been raised, high enough that the enormous crowd gathered there could see her clearly from every angle. She wore a plain robe and a paper mitre placed on her head by her captors, on which someone had written the words heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater, the whole list of everything they'd decided to call her, worn like a crown for the crowd to read as she burned. She asked, before it began, for a crucifix to be held up high enough that she could see it clearly as the flames rose. And a priest standing near the platform did exactly that, holding it in front of her for as long as he possibly could. Witnesses who were there that morning, and who were asked to testify about it again 25 years later when the church finally reopened her case, described the same details with an unusual consistency that historians tend to trust precisely because it's so consistent across people who had no reason to coordinate their stories decades apart. She called out the names of Jesus and of Mary over and over until the smoke finally took her voice from her entirely. She did not scream. One of the English soldiers present is said to have muttered, watching it happen, that they had burned a good woman by mistake. The executioner himself, a man named Geoffroy Théridge, reportedly went home shaking that same night, and told people afterward that he feared he had damned his own soul by carrying out the death of someone genuinely holy. Once it was over, her remains were deliberately raked apart and burned twice more, and what was left of her was finally thrown into the Seine. A decision made specifically so that nothing of her body could ever be kept or venerated or turned into a relic that people might gather around. She was 19. Charles, the king she had personally seen crowned, the man whose entire legitimate claim to his own throne rested substantially on what she had done for him at Orléans and Reims, did nothing at all to save her. The English, in the end, badly misjudged what they had actually accomplished that morning. They had assumed her legend would simply burn along with everything else on that platform, that a peasant girl, discredited, condemned by the church itself, dead in front of a public crowd, would fade quickly from memory, an embarrassing footnote for the losing side to forget as fast as it could. Instead, they had made a martyr, in the most literal sense the word can carry, and martyrs, as it turns out, are almost impossible to argue away simply by ending the life attached to them. Within a year, the English were back at war and steadily losing ground across the very territory Joan had helped reclaim. Within 15 years, Paris itself had fallen back into French hands. Within 25 years, the English had lost nearly everything they'd ever held north of the Loire, and Charles VII sat as the fully legitimate, undisputed king of a country that was, at long last, whole again. It was in that same year, 1456, 25 years after the flames in Rouen, that a church court finally reopened her case at the request of her own family, who had spent a quarter of a century quietly petitioning for exactly this. More than 115 witnesses were gathered and heard over the following months. Childhood neighbors from Domrémy who remembered her as a girl me, ending sheep by the river, soldiers who'd fought beside her at Orléans and Padé, priests who'd guarded her in her final weeks, ordinary people who'd stood in that market square in Rouen and watched her die and had carried the memory of it unspoken for 25 years. They described, again and again, a model prisoner who had prayed constantly, who had forgiven the men interrogating her even as they worked to condemn her, who had never once, under any of it, wavered from what she believed she'd been sent to do. On the 7th of July, 1456, the court formally declared the original trial null and void, procured, in the court's own words, through fraud, malice, and deceit. Joan was innocent. Pierre Cauchon, the bishop who had engineered the whole proceeding and conveniently died years before anyone could hold him personally accountable for it, was posthumously condemned as a heretic himself. One of history's quieter, more satisfying reversals, arriving decades too late to matter to the one person who might actually have wanted to hear it. It took considerably longer for the church to go further than simply clearing her name. She was formally beatified in 1909 and finally canonized a saint on the 16th of May, 1920, in Rome, nearly 500 years after the fire in Rouen. Her feast day was set for the 30th of May, the exact date she died. She became, in time, the patron saint of France itself, of soldiers, of prisoners, and of one particular category that always catches me a little every time I read it: people who are mocked for their faith. It's hard to think of a more fitting title for a girl who was laughed out of a room the first time she ever tried to explain what she believed. No portrait of her survives from her own lifetime. Everything we picture when we picture Joan of Arc comes filtered through later artists' imaginations, working from trial transcripts and second-hand memory rather than an actual likeness. But the testimony that does survive paints a fairly consistent picture underneath all the later paintings and statues. Tall for the standards of her century. Dark hair cut short in the style of a soldier, which she kept that way for the rest of her short life. Strong-jawed, physically capable enough that the men who rode beside her for 11 days to Chinon said, without hesitation, that she sat a horse as well as any of them ever had. At court, when the occasion demanded it, she wore velvet and cloth of gold like anyone of standing would. On campaign, she wore white armor made specifically to fit her, and carried a banner she had commissioned herself, painted with God holding the world in his hands, the words Jesus Maria stitched above it in gold thread. She was never, by the time she reached Chinon, the ragged mystic dragged in from a field that people sometimes imagine. She looked and carried herself like exactly what she had, by then actually become a professional at the very start of an extraordinarily short and extraordinarily consequential career. She never did any of it entirely alone either, and I think that part of the story deserves more room than it usually gets. Dunois, the seasoned commander who technically outranked her at Orléans and had every professional reason to resent a teenage girl being credited with his campaign, became instead one of her most loyal and consistent supporters, and said decades later that her mere presence beside the army had made every soldier in it fight braver than they otherwise would have. Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, the two men who'd escorted her on that 11-day ride to Chinon before anyone knew whether she was a saint or simply a very determined lunatic. Both testified years afterward that they had never fully recovered from the day they learned she'd been burned. Her young page, a boy named Louis de Cautz, remembered her teaching him his prayers properly and quietly correcting him whenever he swore in front of her. Her own younger brother rode with her in her final campaign and was captured right alongside her outside the walls of Compiègne. And it wasn't only soldiers who stood behind her. The Duchess of Lorraine believed her almost on sight when Joan passed through on her way to Vaucouleurs and sent her off with gifts for the road. Yolande of Aragon, the Dauphin's own formidable mother-in-law, and a far shrewder political operator than history tends to give her credit for, made sure Joan was properly clothed, fairly examined, and taken seriously at a court that could easily have simply laughed her back out the gate. A story this size, in the end, never survives on the strength of one person's courage alone. It survives because a great many different people, each for their own reasons, quietly decided to stand behind her when standing behind her cost them something real. And she has never really stopped being claimed by people ever since, which is its own strange kind of afterlife. Napoleon put up a tattoo of her in Paris in 1807, calling her the savior of France, conveniently useful for a country fighting England yet again nearly 400 years after her death. Through the entire 19th century, as France tried repeatedly to work out exactly what kind of country it wanted to be, she became something close to a national symbol that almost everyone, regardless of their politics, could somehow agree to claim as their own. Both world wars saw fresh waves of devotion to her memory. During the second one, astonishingly, both the collaborationist Vichy government and the underground French resistance tried to claim her as their own symbol at the very same time. And both sides, in their own contradictory way, sincerely believed they had earned the right to. She has been, across the centuries since her death, a nationalist icon, a Catholic saint, a symbol claimed by feminists long before the word existed, the subject of countless operas, films, paintings, and at least one very loud rock song. Used, in other words, by nearly everyone who has ever needed a symbol of something larger than themselves. And somehow, remarkably, she has survived being used by all of them, because she has always turned out to be a little bigger than whatever any single use tried to make of her. The girl who kept walking back to Baudricourt's door after being turned away twice is bigger than the statue in Paris. The girl who heard something quiet and impossible to explain in a garden behind her father's house is bigger than any stained glass window built in her honor. She was a real person, born in a real village, and real people, it turns out, are almost always bigger than the symbols we eventually turn them into. Sleep well. We've walked a long road tonight from a small village on the Meuse, all the way to Reims and Compiègne and the smoke over Rouen, and finally to a church 500 years later, admitting it had been wrong. If any part of her story is still sitting with you, I'd love a comment telling me which piece you'll carry to sleep tonight. And if this helped you drift off, a like or a subscribe genuinely helps this little channel keep going. The fire has burned down. The bells have stopped. I'll see you soon.